Hello, kind and loving friends. It has been a while since I've recorded for a number of reasons, but COVID hibernation. And recently I've had a reinvigorated desire to get back to it. I've already made lists of, people I can interview and topics I can talk about. So I figured, well, let's get going with the setup. So I plugged my microphone in with the same settings I've always had, thinking it'll perform like it always has. Except I did this video I tried to do. It was like 12 minutes long. I'm done. I'm reviewing it. And funny thing is, a lot of times I just upload because I know what I just said and if it was okay. But I decided to review it. And lo and behold, the audio, you can tell it wasn't like I, forgot to go off mute, but it was very staticky and crackly. Couldn't figure out why. I'm somewhat techie. When I've been looking for a new computer, they're like, oh, you know so much about computers. Well, sure, compared to people who aren't into them. But anyway, so I played with some of the settings of the microphone, but I didn't think the gain should have to be changed. And only a few settings on Zoom get changed because, different settings for things like voice lessons. But overall, there weren't that many options of things that could have changed. So I'm at a loss. I try as many different settings as I can think of, and then I try to speak what I just changed to kind of journal it. But when it's not working, it doesn't keep track of it. So I Google it, and guess what? One of the solutions is to restart your computer. So I did that. I don't know if that was what finally solved it after like 20 adjustments of other things. But I got on the phone on Zoom to see, is this coming through? Because I kept recording and it wasn't working. So I was like, why don't I see if it works if I'm just another participant? And if it does work, okay, there's something to do with the recording. Because I feel like at some point when I reviewed the recording, it was weird, but when I played it on another device, it was fine, or uploaded it was fine. So I listened through the phone, and even that is having problems until the whole thing seemed to resolve. So then I tested it on the phone, seemed okay. Tested it on the recording, seemed okay. But guess what? The camera's not working. And sometimes it'll shut off if it's been a while. So you just, go press the button or turn it off, turn it on. It's okay. Except not this time. Fiddled. No change. Then I go to download the driver again, like I had to at some point. But it's detecting my operating system as something different than it is. But I figured, let me see if I can update anyway. So I do. It took probably over an hour, I think. It kept saying like 20, no, at one point it said like 5 minutes left, and then it said 25 minutes left, and then it said 20 minutes left for maybe 20 minutes. It was all over the place. So finally it restarts. Finally, it took a long time to restart, to get back up and running, etc. And based on one test and testing through the phone, it seems like it's working, heaven willing. Now, according to my timer, we're almost at 9 minutes already, and I haven't even gotten to the topic at hand. So with that, let me tell you what I learned in Family Home Evening tonight. Tonight, we got to hear for the second time from Celeste Mergens. Have you heard of Days for Girls? It's this really wonderful nonprofit organization that's gone global that helps girls in countries that don't have access to such things obtain feminine hygiene products. Celeste had been helping a friend, I think at orphanages, I think in Africa. But I remember in the last talk, she also talked about Nepal quite a bit, and how when these girls are menstruating, first of all, you can't talk about it. It's so shameful. Even in America, we talk about it more than we used to, but it's still, I think she said people would rather talk about diarrhea than menstruation. And I believe she did in Nepal in the last talk that when girls are menstruating, they're exiled to these huts / sheds, and they just sit there and wait for days. A lot of the times they're sitting on cardboard for days because that's all they have to deal with. So At one point, she prays before bed, God, what can I do? No, I don't know if she knew all that at the time, but working these orphanages with her friend, she prays, what can I do to help these people? God, please let me know. Whatever you want, I'll do it. Just please let me know how I can help. And then she's woken up middle of the night with this question in her mind: what are they doing for feminine hygiene? So she sends off an email expecting to hear back way later, but they respond very quickly and explain the situation. There are even places where the girls might be in school and some evil person comes along offering them one disposable option, but what they have to trade is despicable. What they ask for in trade is despicable and not at all okay. So they create washable options for these girls. And I remember seeing, church notices about service projects where they said, if you have a sewing machine, bring it. This is what we're doing. Somehow I thought it was more connected with the church. She is a member of the church, but it's global. I mean, when you go to their website and look at the team, I didn't count, but I'm thinking over 20 people all over the world. That's really wonderful, I think. So she also, today especially, talked about forgiveness and about her upbringing and various difficulties she had, from living in poverty to having a stepdad that was not kind, let's say, a few other things as well. So she had not spoken to him for many years. And then he came to make amends, try to make things right, recognize what he had done wrong, acknowledge that things were wrong. And she said, you're doing the best you could. And he said, that's no excuse. And I think that's really important to think, because I remember having a professor in grad school that said she likes to try to believe people are doing the best they can. She dealt with this young kid once who was just a pain in everybody's posterior. And at some point she got to know him, and he was like one of 8 kids. And his acting out was the only way he could get any attention with all those kids. And so it was kind of a coping mechanism for him, even though it drove people nuts. It wasn't him trying to drive people nuts. It was him trying to get what he wanted. So she also said that due to her upbringing, it helped her to recognize the needs of those who don't have much and to be non-judgmental, since she had experiences not that different from what they've experienced. So one question I asked, we hear a story within an hour, let's say. So it sounds like it happens overnight. That can be someone forgiving someone, or it can be building a nonprofit. But when you hear it within an hour, it sounds like it happened so quickly, efficiently. They just knew what to do. And every step of the way it came easily. And so as the audience, we might have the idea of how can we do that and think, oh, it's, it must just not be meant to be. They were meant to be, but since I don't just inherently know what to do, maybe just give up on dreams of helping people in certain ways. So that'll come around later. But I asked, okay, so we hear about the atonement being for those who've done the terrible things, but what about when you're the recipient of the terrible behavior? The atonement is supposed to work for those people too. How do you access and use the atonement for that? That's been a question on my mind for a long time, because in my opinion, if someone has done nothing terribly wrong and they have been hurt, in my mind, they're the priority to get healed first, to get attention first. In my world, I would say they're more deserving. I mean, they're the one who's done nice things, been a good person. And the person who needs to repent and has done the terrible things, sure, that's nice that the atonement's available to them too, but they're the one who did the bad thing. They chose to do that behavior. So as the recipient, as the someone who's trying to be a kind, loving person and is a recipient of negative, harmful behavior, what does one do to say, okay, Jesus, like, take it, here you go, bye? It sounds like it's that easy. Like, here's a basket, I'm giving it to you, see you later. But in practice, it seems like that's not real. If it were, we'd probably only need to be alive a few days to get all our lessons learned and then be done. I remember hearing of a woman whose husband died, I don't think terribly young, around, past retirement age, I think, getting towards senior citizenship, etc. And it took her 10 years to be able to go through the closet and decide if she wanted to donate his clothes. 10 years. For some people, that sounds like a lot. To me, it makes sense. And I think no one can know what it felt like for her. And so no one can say that's too long. Not even her, maybe, because as she stands at the day that she can get rid of them, she may look back and not really remember the person who couldn't do it. Maybe she was doing the best she could. And so often when we look back, we might judge ourselves more harshly, thinking, I should have done this, I should have done that, saying things that aren't even possible in earthly life, holding ourselves to a standard that maybe we could have had in heaven before we came here, but we aren't able to access psychic powers, thinking, I should have known this. I've heard that from people. Why did I take the dog for a walk? I should have known he was going to have a heart attack. Why did I go? If only I'd been there, I could have saved him. All kinds of things. So how do we let it go? Because I remember even before any songs were out, there was a comedian on a cruise ship that said something about, I think, his interactions with his wife, and the big phrase of the house was, let it go. So I recall someone repeating that as if it's just that easy. Just, oh, thank you for the reminder. I forgot. Okay, just because you told me, I can just let it go just like that. Well, if only it were that simple. So the funny phrases I used that she seemed to really like, she said she even wrote down and may reuse them. I said, what is the recipe to give it over to Jesus? How do we find the FedEx route to send it to its destination of him without getting lost and coming back to us? I've got to go to my next bit of notes. So she said, ask yourself, what is it you are wanting from this place of pain? Could it be that you want to feel safe? You want to feel loved? You want to know why they did it to you? If you can be in that still place, be still, listen for what it is. Sometimes it can surprise you. Where it comes, the message comes and it's like, wow, that makes total sense. Pay attention to that inner feeling you get. You didn't feel safe. You didn't feel welcome. You didn't feel wanted. So what is it that I'm expecting or wanting? What hits here? You can then decide that it can mean differently. I am safe. I am well. I am wanted. I am held by the being that created all that is. And she said, it's not a one-time thing. It can feel like a deep hole, and that you can even let go of getting it right and say to God, I don't think I'm very good at this. You know what, Lord? I'm mad and really frustrated. And I'm afraid of that moment that happened. And this whole thing is bigger than me. And she said, you can just call it out. And then if you are coming instead of bitterness and all that swirling in the head, instead try curiosity. Back to saying, what if, Lord, what if you let me know why that happened? Because this girl is clueless. That's what she said. I keep saying it's yours now, and it keeps sticking to me like glue. So if you could please take this, because I do not love this. So I thought that was very good advice. And The other notion I shared after in my previous video, this isn't what we discussed tonight, but I feel like every time forgiveness is brought up, I need to mention a few things because I have been seeking knowledge and learning about forgiveness for so long. I think a lot of people try to use forgiveness almost like a weapon. People might say things like, you need to forgive them. And when they say that, sometimes it seems like they don't know what that means, because let's just say you had an uncle that every time you saw him, he yells at you, he swears at you, because he's just an angry guy. You don't deserve it. You didn't instigate anything. He just decides to pick on you. Maybe you're kind of stuck seeing him because your family drags you to family events and you're a kid, there's no getting around it. But then you become an adult and you say, you know what? I'd love to hang out with the family, but I don't want to be around him. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to see him. That does not mean you haven't forgiven. If you are not sitting there stewing in anger and hoping he slips on the ice, and if even better, if you can be at peace and wish him well, wish him a good life, pray for him, hope that he is healthy and happy in his life. I think most experts, trustworthy, safe people experts would say that's forgiveness. You do not have to go hang out with him for all the rest of your life whenever he's going to be at a gathering and subject yourself to that same behavior over and over and over, which he has shown is a pattern that's not going to stop. And you can forgive them whether they come and apologize and admit how terrible they were, or whether they do not acknowledge how terrible they were, whether they even try to pretend, well, you deserved it, you were being a bratty little kid, something like that. Doesn't matter. You can choose to not actively have such negative feelings towards them. But guess what? For some people, staying away from the source of the problem is how they can remain in peace. If they were to go and hang out again, it could very likely recreate the whole cycle. There's not much benefit in subjecting yourself to abuse over and over and over. That's not helping the forgiveness notion. Whereas if you keep them at a distance, you're able to heal yourself. It's kind of like how you have surgery and you heal in the hospital and things get cleaned out from the incision. Whereas, let's say you cut yourself in a swamp and it was likely to get infected. If you just go get surgery, get it cleaned out, and then go back in the swamp, not only will it likely get infected as it was before, it might get worse. So going back to the source of the problem, it's just unwise. And I've often mentioned the books by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend, Boundaries. It's very popular in my circles. They use scripture to talk about how God wants us to have boundaries. And I love that because sometimes there are people who you like to use scriptures as weapons. They're not the kind of people I like to hang out with. They may identify as religious people, but religion is not a weapon. God is not a weapon. The Bible is not a weapon. So they will sometimes cite the whole turn the other cheek thing as if that means go back to the swamp. But I remember I minored in religious studies. Most of those people saying those things have never taken a religious studies class. They've maybe heard from their preacher. That's a whole other thing. So I've heard that there's this whole context. You know how in some cultures, like one hand is considered clean, one hand is considered dirty. You don't touch people with the dirty hand, etc. And the front and back of your hand can have different meanings. So from what I understand, there was something about it that had nothing to do with like offering him to hit you again so that he'll hit you again. It was something of, if you turn your cheek, that will force him to either use the back of his hand, which means such and such, which you wouldn't want to do, or hit you with the other hand, which for some other cultural reason wouldn't be acceptable. And That's very different than how we operate, at least in America today. So if we have no framework to understand that, and we just put our current lens, then we're not understanding what it actually means. But again, the book Save People is wonderful. I want to reread Boundaries, but Save People was so great that I think within the first few chapters, I did like a 40-minute YouTube talking about many of the wonderful points. And I think it's really important to remember, if you were surrounded by unsafe people and they were older than you growing up, you might think, wow, like you just kind of assume adults know what they're talking about, that they have their life together, that they're more mature and developed and evolved. Think about it. You can have a 5-year-old who's extremely mature, a 16-year-old who's more mature than a 40-year-old, and you can have a 50-year-old that acts like a 10-year-old. So the number of times you've been on the earth revolving around the sun has very little to do with how much you've chosen to progress. Having worked in mental health, we learn when people gain a substance addiction, they basically stop emotionally maturing. So you could have a 44-year-old who started drinking at age 14, and so he's developmentally and emotionally like a 14-year-old. So if he stops drinking at 44, he's more like 14-year-old in a 44-year-old body, and we'll have to start from there, gaining life wisdom, emotional wisdom. So I think these are important things to make sure we point out. Healthy forgiveness, godly forgiveness does not mean that you go back to someone who's been abusive, no matter how much they want it. It is not service. It is not God's will to go back to any situation that has shown a lifetime pattern of any kind of negative behavior. It doesn't have to be severe, put you in the hospital, physical abuse. It can be emotional abuse. It can be so subtle that they can do it in front of others and nobody seems to notice or help or realize. Maybe they're not the safest people either if they're not calling out, that's not okay to say, something like that. And you're allowed to have boundaries that make you comfortable. You are allowed to honor your own domain. I have other videos talking about domain and boundaries. I was actually discussing this with someone the other day. Some people have learned to take on responsibility for other people's emotions, which we really usually can't do. And for whatever reason, the way they grew up, they believe it's their responsibility. So they will make themselves uncomfortable so that someone else can be comfortable. Even if they don't like the person, so often they will go out of their way to be accommodating to them because maybe they grew up where people in their life couldn't take care of their own emotions. So it was their job to manage those emotions. You'll see a lot of that from like Dr. Phil podcasts and other areas. There's even times where people might try to take care of other people's physical health, going out of their way to bring things that they don't even need so that in case someone needs it, they'll have it. And it's funny because that's the type of person who might end up being late to something or taking longer to arrive than expected because as they were walking out the door, they thought, oh gosh, I don't need a Band-Aid, but let me just get some because maybe someone I'm going to be with needs it. That's probably not a great example because you never know when you're going to need a Band-Aid, but something else. Or maybe I really need a Band-Aid, but let me just get it anyway, something like that. And then they're late. And then depending who's waiting, sometimes the person might, a lot of people that are very good at being on time will think, oh, this person doesn't respect my time, they're rude, etc. They can't get their act together. When in reality, they were ready. They were trying to leave. And then the thing that delayed them was actually something of kindness. And if that person who's so timely needs a Band-Aid, at that point, they're finally going to be glad that person had one. And yet they probably still won't realize and might think, oh, you should just have these packed all the time, whatever. So it's 4:30 in the morning. I'm excusing myself from losing my train of thought, but it's well worth the idea to think of loving people from a distance, especially when they are people that caused you to need to forgive them because of their actions. There's no need to go back to the swamp. If they like to play in the swamp of bacteria, you are welcome to pray for them from a distance, think loving thoughts from them from a distance, and definitely don't, their opinion is probably one of the least viable opinions to be listening to. I was also thinking regarding domain and boundaries. It's interesting how it's different in public versus at someone's house. Like when you're at someone's house, in my opinion, it is their domain. That's not my opinion. It is. And so if they have rules for their house that you don't have at yours, it's kind of your obligation to follow their rules, their house. So let's say at your house, you put your feet up on the couch with shoes on. But in their house, not only is that not okay, but they want you to take your shoes off. Now, granted, I know a comedian who makes a big stink about this. Like when I put my shoes on at home, they stay on until I come back home. But it's not that uncommon, especially in certain cultures, to require shoes off in the house. So my point is that is a time where if I'm visiting them, even if I'm a little bit uncomfortable with my shoes off, if I don't have some condition where I can't walk without shoes or something, then I do believe there's obligation within their domain to take shoes off. Same thing, like we're in a pandemic. If you want people to wash their hands upon arrival in your house, I think for the rest of our lives, that's more than reasonable. Now, if you are going out to lunch with them at a restaurant, then you're in neutral public domain. It doesn't make as much sense to say to them, you need to wash your hands when we arrive at the restaurant. Now, unless you're at some kind of restaurant where it's expected you're going to be sharing food with your hands from the same plate, but because you're not in your own home domain, now you can just take care of yourself. Excuse me, I'm going to go wash my hands. But it's neutral domain. You don't really get to say what they do there. However, think about a hospital situation. If your grandma is in the hospital and you're kind of her main point of contact, and then your sisters or brothers' kids come to visit, if you are kind of the voice for your grandma, then you do kind of have say over, okay, kids, when you're going to visit, everybody's got to wash their hands because we need to keep grandma safe. That's a little different, even though it's kind of public. The building may be public, but especially when someone is more fragile, that becomes their domain, their space that will be visited, and the person who's kind of their voice is speaking on behalf of that domain. So that's kind of a more tricky one that I wouldn't put as like a baseline example. It kind of just came to mind. But I just think of, if anybody criticizes asking to wash hands upon arrival from COVID on, that might not be a very safe person. And it could be better to end the conversation earlier than later. There is another story with that, probably for some other time. We're now at 36 minutes. So it's wise to consider, whose domain are we in? What's my domain? What are my boundaries? For example, let's say you have that uncle that comes to visit, or your brother, and maybe he's from a culture they just love to touch your face when they greet you. Okay. First, you get to decide if they touch you ever at all. But second of all, That's a time where even if you're in public and you know he's likely to touch your face, you can say to him, look, I love your affection and I'm happy to have you touch my face after you've washed your hands. That's a different story. And again, in reality, kind, safe people never would be criticizing someone for having those boundaries, even before the pandemic. But since we've been in the pandemic, hopefully everyone will respect anyone who wants to maintain pandemic level standards of cleanliness, etc. So I guess I've combined a few topics into one. Talked about getting back to recording, what was learned on the Zoom meeting, and forgiveness, boundaries, domain, consent, some hygiene standards with the pandemic. That seems like enough for now. So thank you for tuning in, and peace be with you.